to a Thursday night edition of the Strictly Stripes podcast. Muhammad Ahmad and Mike Neislick here with you as Andrew Gillis has the night off. And we've been doing some position reviews. We talked about the quarterback position, the running back position. We'll pick up on that later next week, but to take a little pause, we want to kind of reflect more as we've been talking about, how this is the off season of the extension. We talked a lot about that with Joe Burrow on Tuesday. We talked a lot about that with T. Higgins last Friday. And what kind of comes to mind, and people will be confused when I say this, but think about the big three with the Brooklyn Nets. Obviously, it's basketball, but here's why I bring this up. You had Kevin Durant, James Harden, Kyrie Irving. The big three, they're supposed to win all these titles, conference titles. I don't think they played more than 20 games together due to injuries, controversy, and so many other things. And now they're all basically out of Brooklyn. So you're thinking, Muhammad, why are you bringing this up about football? Well, because you think about Joe Burrow, you think about T. Higgins, you think about Jamar Chase. That's your big three. And that's one of the biggest big threes in the entire NFL, I think. And so the question is, do you focus exclusively on locking down Joe Burrow for life, or do you try to lock him down with the big three to keep Higgins, to keep Chase? Again, Chase isn't eligible for an extension until next season. Higgins is. There haven't been any talks as far as we know, or we don't even know if there have been. But we saw on NFL Network, T. Higgins said that he wants to be in Cincinnati for a while. Jamar Chase was on NFL Network the day before that saying he knows what Joe Burrow wants, and that's to have his weapons with him. Of course, this is just Jamar Chase giving his take on it. So really, Mike, just to jump into it, should the Bengals, as much as the ball is in Burrow's court, should they really try to focus on doing something that keeps the big three together for as long as possible? Or do you say, look, Joe, you're the guy, and I'm sure they're going to obviously keep Jamar, in the long term, but we can't completely keep everyone, including T. We're just going to keep you locked in. I mean, what do you make of this? Do you focus on the big three, or do you just focus on Joe Burrow and let the cards fall where they may?
Well, it depends. I mean, if what Jamar and T and what Jamar said about Joe is correct. I mean, if they're not, just assuming that he's willing to take less, then the dominoes are lining up where you can keep all three. I mean, if all three are willing to take less to stay together, there's no reason why I don't think you can try that, and you could structure each of the contracts to sort of try to maximize the rest of your roster. But I mean, and I think shared sacrifice is a nice way to do it. So Joe takes less, but then T and Jamar take a little bit less as well to A, all stay together, and B, to try to piece together the rest of the roster. So I mean, what Jamar says is right about Joe Burrow, and T said he wants to stay and take a little bit less. I think there's no reason why you can't keep all three, and there's no reason why that would kind of make the contract for Burrow the years any less. I don't think, but but that depends. I mean, it's all if they are willing to follow through, and when the contracts are offered and those dollar amounts are lower than maybe they're worth. That's see, they'll have to do the talking when the contracts are offered.
If you look at T. Higgins' current deal, according to Spot Track, his rookie deal is going into the last year of it. It's worth about just over $8.5 million. So his average salary is about over $2 million. But they estimate that his market value is well worth over $80 million, which means he's worth an annual salary of $20 million. That's a lot. And I think that's rightfully so. I mean, he showed why he's capable of not just being in his role, but he's capable of being a number one receiver. I know Dan Orlovsky from ESPN asked him also on Thursday, I should have mentioned this too, he asked him, do you think you're capable of being a number one receiver? And of course the answer is going to be yes, but he gave such a commanding yes. And one of the things he said was when Jamar Chase was out, I filled his shoes, when Chase was out for 4 games in the middle of the year before and after the bye week with a hip injury. So he knows his worth. He obviously knows that internally, but he means what he says and he says what he means. So he knows there's definitely money on the table. He's well aware of that. But like you said, though, he really wants to be in Cincinnati. Joe Burrow, we talked about this, and I'm going to talk with Marissa Contepelli, the Bengals team reporter, about this here later in the show just to kind of tease that. I think Joe Burrow, to follow up on what we talked about Tuesday, Mike, I think he's that guy who, yes, he knows there's money on the table. He wants to think about his future. But as much as he believes in himself and the fact that he can play with anybody, he knows what he has with T. what he has with T. He knows what he has with Jamar. I mean, we don't know about Hayden Hurst because he's the only player who's a starter who's not on contract for next year, but he might want Hayden Hurst too. Like, he's probably willing to maybe leave some room open for a guy like him to stick around for at least a little bit longer, even if it's not as long as T and Jamar. I think you definitely, if you're the Bengals and if you're Joe Burrow, like if I'm looking at it from both points of view, I think you definitely have to think about the greater good. Because here's the thing. It's Cincinnati. They have the sixth most cap space in the league, but this isn't a market like Dallas or Denver or LA where it's a bigger market and you have more money. On NFL terms, at least, Cincinnati is a smaller market. And I think they know that. And it doesn't take away from the fact that all three can get paid, but it's a matter of, will you be willing to take just a little less if it means you have each other and you will and can be contenders as they've been the last 2 years, two conference title games, a Super Bowl appearance, and only their first year together, at least the three of them were together. I think you have to lean that way, but I could also see the other way around because I know I want your kind of thoughts on this. Steve Spagnuolo, the Chiefs defensive coordinator, during media week this week at the Super Bowl, was someone, he was saying that he compared Burrow as someone being like Tom Brady, that he can win with anybody. And I think as much as T loves Cincinnati, I think people don't love leaving money on the table. I think they already know Jamar is going to get extended next year. That's a given. I mean, could you maybe understand why the Bengals try to focus more on locking down Joe and locking down Jamar, and maybe not that they're not going to give T an extension, but maybe waiting a little bit with T? Like, do you think they play the waiting game and kind of see how this year goes, or do they think, okay, we just got to give T something? Like, where do you think they ultimately end up going with this, if you had to guess, just based on numbers and predictions?
The priority, obviously, is to get Joe Burrow's contract done first so you know what you have and you know how to structure the rest because you're looking at Jamar next year. I mean, there's only a handful of teams, looking on Spot Track, that for their wide receiver pool all together makes more than $40 million. There's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 teams. And I mean, you're talking about Jamar probably being able to go upwards of 30 and T at 20. Right. You just can't probably afford that. Like, that's too much for both of them to then also fill out the rest of the receiver room and also have room for other things. So, I mean, you're probably talking about, is T willing to take somewhere in the ballpark of like a $17.5 million deal? And will Jamar come down a little bit to like 25? Because then I think if you get both of those at those kind of annual rates, you could probably do it. If Joe takes a little bit less, I think you're able to kind of piece that together. But and I don't think that's asking too much of each player. Because like I said, I think the key is the shared sacrifice part. If everybody's willing to take like $5 million, around $5 million less, you could probably keep the trio together long term. Is it the best move? You don't know. You can draft a gem to replace T. Higgins, and maybe it all works out. But sometimes that's not the easiest thing to just go say and do. And also, T and Jamar are both sort of on, only going to be on their second contract, so they're all three are ascending and not sort of close to their plateau yet. I think you have some time to work with that trio, and I think they can be better together. I don't think you're not paying for what they've done. You're still paying for what they're going to do. A lot of times those big contracts in baseball, you're kind of paying for what these guys did, in the first 5-7 years of their prime. T and Jamar, still got some really good years here coming up. So I think if they're willing to walk the walk, then I think you absolutely go for all three. If they're willing to do that.
And I think nothing you laid out is unrealistic. They could definitely, I could see all of them taking sort of that $3 to $5 million less if it means playing with someone like Joe Burrow who's going to make them compete for a Super Bowl every year. I also don't think it's unrealistic to say, we love T, T's great, but we just can't maybe afford what he's asking for. Let's try to maybe fish for someone in the draft who can mirror what he did. And I don't think it's impossible. Not that T. Higgins is like your average receiver, but it's just, you can always get like a 6'4", 6'5".
Joe Burrow's going to – I don't think you ask Joe Burrow to take less and say we're going to do draft, replacement for T. Higgins. I think the discussion if I take – but it's like if I take $5 million less, what's the plan? $5 million less per year, do you invest in T? Like they're going to know going into this what everyone wants. I mean, I think it's obvious Jamar's had conversations about this with Joe and with T, and so like they're going to come with a plan and say like we're all together, like let's get this done. Or obviously Jamar can't sign until next year, but that would be the plan. So I don't think there's any like you don't sign Joe Burrow and then just sort of like in a vacuum. You kind of evaluate what he wants to do,
yeah.
and I think they take that into account. It sounds like in terms of he's not dictating it, but I would think that if he's willing to take less, they'll listen to how he kind of would like to see if it's contingent upon keeping T, and T will probably have a heads up there from Joe that he's going to try to do that. So I don't think these players are not sort of communicating about what they want to do here.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. What I meant to say was like, let's say, they all go in with a plan and maybe they don't give T what he wants and they figure, okay, we'll just focus on Joe, focus on drafting someone, whatever. But like you said, though, that's not going to happen without obviously all of them being, not in a vacuum together, like you said, because like they're all going into this together. It's very collective, and that's a good thing because it shows like they want to be together, they want to play together. It's just a matter of can everybody get what they want, and that's why you have agents, which we are not, and so ultimately it's going to come down to them and Duke Tobin and the rest of the Bengals front office. But I really think you think about big threes like in any sport, basketball, football. Like if we're talking football, like I think this is a good comparable example that's recent. You go back to 2020, the Buccaneers signed Tom Brady. Granted, he is the GOAT and is the GOAT now that he's retired, but you have him, you have Mike Evans, who I think is a future Hall of Famer. You have Chris Godwin, who maybe, I don't know if I'd put him on the elite status that I'd put like T. Higgins or Chase on, but like he's up there, and he's shown it as he's been with the Buccaneers, especially with Brady. I mean, and then you maybe actually call me crazy, switch him out and put Gronkowski in. Gronkowski comes from New England out of retirement, joins Brady. That big three, had a big role in why the Buccaneers made it to the Super Bowl as a wild card team and won. And we could talk about, COVID and this and that. That was a big three. And you could even say big four if you want to talk about Godwin. And I get it. It's Tom Brady. You're talking about one of the greatest to ever do it. But like I just said, Steve Spagnuolo is trying to compare Burrow in the likeness of someone like Brady, if not someone like, Peyton Manning, because we've heard the Manning versus Brady comparisons with like him and Patrick Mahomes. So I absolutely think it is so imperative no matter what else happens. Maybe you cut Joe Mixon, you don't re-sign Samaje Perine, maybe move on from Hayden Hurst and draft his replacement, whether it's Mike Mayer, Luke Musgrave, whoever. I think if you can just nail those three down, pending anything else that happens with free agency in the draft at other positions, I think the Bengals are in very good shape, and they're in very good shape for a long time. Well, stay with us because, like I mentioned earlier, Marissa Contepelli, the Bengals senior producer and team reporter, joins me to talk all things offseason as we set the stage for everything else that Mike and I haven't mentioned, plus much, much more right here on the Strictly Stripes podcast. And thank you for staying with us on the Strictly Stripes podcast. Joining me is my very, very special guest, Bengals team reporter and senior producer, Marissa Contepelli, who I got to know very well this season. Marissa, been meaning to do this for a while, so I appreciate you joining me. How are you? How is the off-season, if we really even want to call it an off-season, if that's such a word?
I know, right? Like in the NFL, there is never truly an off season, but no, it's been good. Of course, wish we would have still been going this week, but it's been nice to have a little bit of downtime, rest and relaxation, getting recharged for what is going to be a fun combine, free agency, draft period here coming up. So a lot of exciting things on the horizon, and yeah, just kind of getting the buttons and the battery recharged because it's going to be a whirlwind here before we know it, once we kind of get, back into the swing of things.
Yeah, perfectly well stated. Could not have summed that up any better. And like you said, it is going to be a whirlwind before we know it. The combine is in just over 3 weeks, probably less than that at this point if I look at the calendar. But yeah, things are moving. Got the combine, free agencies just a little over a week after that. And that's really been, I think, a big emphasis for the Bengals is, what's going to happen with a lot of their big names like Jesse Bates, Von Bell, Jermaine Pratt, just to name a few. I've talked with Andrew Gillis and Mike Nizick about it. Kind of the estimation we have is we don't know that the Bengals would bring back Jesse Bates or Jermaine Pratt, more so because, we kind of call this the offseason of the extension because you got Joe Burrow's extension coming up. T. Higgins could be up for an extension here soon. What do you think is going to be sort of the emphasis in free agency? Where do you think the Bengals try to focus retaining certain pieces, and where do you think they might have to let some guys walk to kind of let things play out, going into the draft and whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, Mohammed, that's the big question. That's the biggest question, I think, going into this offseason is what is free agency going to look like for this team? And, I think you kind of hit it right on the head is that retaining some of those valuable assets that the team has had, especially on the defensive side, has to be, a high priority. So realistically, are they going to be able to bring back every single free agent that was on this team from this year? Most likely not. I would be surprised if that did happen. Just the way, money works and, trying to navigate through what different contracts could potentially look like. But I mean, when you look at, you have Jesse Bates, Jermaine Pratt, Von Bell, those are really, the three big ones that stick out in my mind. I would expect at least one of them to return. Which one? It'll be interesting to see just kind of how it plays out. And, what other pieces, could be available in free agency, who else could become available. So, a lot to be seen on that side. And then, I mean, you look at the offensive side too. I mean, Hayden Hurst, I would be surprised if he's not back in stripes next year. I thought he had a phenomenal year, and just the way he talks about this coaching staff and the organization, I can't see Hayden playing anywhere else. I think he's meant to be in Cincinnati and is meant to be a Bengal. So I would fully, would hope that the team, decides to bring him back too. But extensions, I mean, oh my goodness, this is going to be the year of so much talk about Joe Burrow extension, T. Higgins, as you mentioned. And then another one is Logan Wilson. I mean, he's another player I think you have to look at making an extension to, because how do you not want to keep him a Cincinnati Bengal as well, right?
Yeah, I'm actually glad you mentioned Logan Wilson. He is also entering his final year of his rookie contract, so he is eligible for an extension. But I want to ask you this, though. So like you said, with free agency, will they bring everyone back? Probably not. I'd be just as amazed if somehow you bring back every single key piece that I just kind of listed there. But, with the extensions, Joe Burrow is that's going to be a done deal. That's a no-brainer. I'd say T. Higgins, if I had to guess, is a kind of a 50-50 toss-up. But do you think we could see a Logan Wilson extension? Because I'm glad you mentioned that. I haven't really brought this up much because maybe I've focused more on, T. Higgins and Joe Burrow. But what do you think happens with Wilson? Do you think he gets an extension, or do you think they wait until next year and maybe pay him more next year once they kind of get this offseason figured out? Or what do you think that'll look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a lot of it will have to do with what happens with Joe Burrow and those extension talks, because I'd have to think if they were able to get something done this offseason, then they could potentially look at extending Logan this year instead of waiting until next year. I would be shocked if an extension with Logan Wilson isn't on the table at some point here within the next year, whether it's this offseason or waiting until next year. But also why run the risk of waiting another year? Why not just kind of, get that done and get that taken care of while it's, right in front of you? So, I mean, I think that one's a no-brainer. Logan has played just incredibly well. You just look at his stats. I mean, I believe he did not have an interception this year, but he still has the most interceptions for a linebacker.
He did have one interception.
Okay, one interception. So one, but it still has the most for a linebacker since he was drafted. He's a 3-down linebacker. He never comes off the field. It's a play caller. So it's a no-brainer to keep him here in Cincinnati, whatever that takes.
Yeah, and I think, like you mentioned, Marissa, that makes a lot of sense, to where Logan Wilson, he was that 3rd-down linebacker. He's very versatile. He's shown that in 3 seasons. I think it would make more sense to extend him and keep him long-term, maybe let Jermaine Pratt walk, since I think he wants to be more of a 3rd-down linebacker. He's made that known this year. And I think he knows there might be more money on the table elsewhere that he might not want to leave, which I think in his case I could definitely understand, since, it was a contract year. He wants to increase his value, and I think he definitely did do that. He played just as well as Logan Wilson in a different sense. I think he was more of an on-the-ball defender, whereas Logan Wilson was more of your tackling machine. Doesn't mean one's better than the other, but I think they just both complemented each other so well. But to go back to the Joe Burrow extension question, there was an interesting thing that Jamar Chase told Andrew Siciliano on NFL Network, which is that, it'll figure itself out. It'll work itself out. And he kind of maybe gave something away. It said, I think he knows he wants to have his weapons with him. So although only Joe Burrow and his agent in the front office know better than us. Could you see a situation where maybe Joe Burrow isn't, he doesn't mind maybe not making what Patrick Mahomes and Deshaun Watson makes, but he at least is paid well enough to where he still has Jamar Chase, still has T. Higgins? Or do you think it's going to be more about, hey, like, I'm one of the best players in the league, like, make me a top 5 player? Like, if you kind of had to guess based on what Jamar said and what others are saying, what do you kind of make of that?
Yeah, purely speculation on my part, and just, like you said, an absolute guess, because I have no insider information when it comes to this. Just knowing Joe and the type of person Joe is, Joe's a winner. He wants to win. You have to have pieces around you to be able to do that. You can make all the money in the world, and we've seen that with different quarterbacks and different contracts, but when you don't have, the necessary weapons and pieces, you're only going to get so far. So it would not surprise me one bit if what Jamar said, does come to light, and that Burrow ends up taking structuring his contract that allows the Bengals to have a little bit more flexibility and, money and funds to be able to pay different players, whatever it might take. But it also wouldn't surprise me if he kind of goes the other way, because it's a lot of money you're leaving on the table when you think about your future and your family and life after football and setting yourself up for that. So
right.
It's a tough one. And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer when it comes, either way. It's just going to be, what is Joe going to decide? Is kind of most importance to him right now at this time. And so, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see just kind of how it plays out and how much winning a Super Bowl, having those certain pieces in place do come into play for Joe Burrow. But you also have to remember the Bengals have drafted extremely well over the last few years. And so many of those pieces are here on rookie deals. So it doesn't mean that they can't go into the draft and, and find another weapon, another valuable key piece to help contribute to if however it ends up playing out with Joe's contract.
Yeah, the ball, I think, really is in his court at this point. Does he want to go for the long ball? Does he want to kind of get that, $45, $50 million a year guaranteed, kind of like you see from Aaron Rodgers, Mahomes, Watson? Or, does he want to be kind of closer to like what Josh Allen is making, kind of in that court, closer to 38 a year, and have that flexibility to keep Jamar, to keep T? And I mean, because he's such a winner, I'm sure he's probably thinking about the fact that, like you mentioned, Logan Wilson's up for an extension. Like, I think he's thinking even beyond his own weapons and his own team, because that's the thing. Like, Joe's not just the leader of the offense. Like, he's the leader of the locker room. He's the leader of the team. And I think, it kind of reminds me of like what Tom Brady did when he was in New England. He did not get rich when he played in New England. He didn't even get rich in Tampa Bay. I mean, obviously he had his money through his TB12 brand and his Under Armour endorsement. So I don't know what Joe Burrow was thinking on that sense, but like if he wanted the money maybe elsewhere in endorsements, I think he'd have no issue with that. So he can maybe set up his contract where you have those like odd years, kind of like Brady had, because that's what helped the Patriots get Rob Gronkowski and a lot of those other weapons that basically built a dynasty. And I think that's what Joe Burrow wants. Like, he said the championship window is his whole career. Tom Brady said the same thing along those lines when he was Burrow's age back in his prime. So that's what he wants. I mean, the money is definitely there, and you have to think about your family, and that's a great point. I also think he's just going to kind of weigh it to where he also knows what's best for the team. And that's, I think, what really shows this team hit the jackpot with him, not just with his talent, but the fact that, like, he's so unselfish. He's so centered on the team over himself. I think maybe that's not something that people are overlooking, but it's just worth mentioning because that's part of why, like, he's an MVP finalist and why I told Andrew and Mike this, I think he'll be the preseason favorite for MVP. Do you agree with that assessment? Do you think Burrow could be the preseason favorite next year?
I don't see why he wouldn't be. I mean, everything he's done over the last 2 seasons, he just continues to rise. I mean, it would not shock me. He should be on that list. He should be one of the favorites for preseason MVP, especially when you look at, who's coming back for the Bengals too. And kind of once the team starts to take shape a little bit, he absolutely should be in that conversation. And Mom, I just want to go back to what you're just saying about Joe and just that he's so unselfish. Like, he's really a team first guy. And you could not have said that better. Like, it amazes me, like from Joe Burrow right down, through the entire 53 and even the coaching staff, there are no egos in this locker room. And it is just, I feel like such such a blessing to have here because that's not the case everywhere. And every guy, especially on the veterans that I've talked to, have said it makes such a big difference when you have unselfish guys who truly just want to win, who want to play with one another, do what's best for the team. And it's a huge reason why this culture shift that Zach Taylor and the front office staff, wanted to bring in when Zach came here in 2019. And it took a couple of years to get to this point. And we really saw it start to take shape last season in the Super Bowl run. And I feel like it took an even step further this year with this team. Was just so special. And I mean, it starts with the face of your franchise and your quarterback. And Joe Burrow has just absolutely set that tone for what this locker room is and what the culture, is really here in Cincinnati. And it's a great thing to see.
People, like to say, oh, culture's so cliche, leadership is so cliche, but I think you have to make an exception with this because I've never been in other NFL locker rooms. This is the first and only NFL team I've covered, but you could just tell whether it's, someone like Joe Burrow, whose career is so storied for as young as he is, or whether it's someone on the practice squad, or maybe someone who elevated himself from the practice squad, like Trenton Irwin, or a veteran like Tyler Boyd. Like Tyler Boyd always says, like, we're going to win because we have Joe Burrow. Like those are his exact words. Trenton Irwin has kind of said something along those lines too. And you think about where he was being on the practice squad for almost 3 years until, he got the nod in the middle of the season and it paid dividends. Like, it is not a cliche thing to say. I think there's such a case to be made that, when you're in such a professional league that's so competitive, it's so cutthroat, without calling out other teams, like you will see some egos on other franchises and other teams. And that's where you have problems. And sometimes you can have so much talent, but a lot of those teams can't materialize, not because they're not good, but because they can't find a way to bring everything together. Like we've seen this happen with some really good teams in the last decade and even historically before that. And so I want to kind of maybe wrap up with this to, follow up on that. You talk about the culture and the leadership and how like Joe Burrow has set the stage of like, players like Ted Karras. You mentioned Hayden Hurst, like guys like that want to come to Cincinnati. Like Hayden Hurst said, he wanted to come to Cincinnati because he saw the Super Bowl run they made last year while he was sitting in Florida during the offseason. How do you see that boosting potential free agent signings, this coming March, no matter who stays or goes? Like if they bring in other guys, how much of a factor do you think that is as far as maybe why other guys might want to sign with the Bengals, even if they're not making the most money, but just to come win because you got a guy like Joe Burrow and you got someone like Zach Taylor?
Oh, it's huge. I think it's everything. Outside of, I know money talks in this league. It's tough to turn down when you're making X amount of $1 million, right? But when you have the opportunity to go play for a contender, let alone a contender that has the type of quarterback that the Bengals do, the type of head coach that the Bengals do, and just the overall, like, again, I know it's cliche, but that culture, just the closeness of this team, it's a no-brainer. I mean, why would free agents want to come here? And I know I feel like we kind of joked about it last year. It was like, oh, it's the Joe Burrow effect, but it really is the Joe Burrow effect. I mean, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. I mean, we saw it last year when the Bengals were able to get Hayden Hurst, Ted Karras, Lil Collins, Alex Kappa, and just so many different key free agent pieces. And even the year before with Trey Hendrickson, DJ Reader coming in 2020. Mike Hilton, Von Bell, Chidobe Awuzie. It's that Joe Burrow effect where these players, and I think players around the league, I think they can tell just how special of a player Joe Burrow is and what he brings to the table on a day in and day out basis. And when you have someone like that at the forefront of your team, a leader in this locker room, why wouldn't you want to play along someone like that? I feel like it's a no-brainer.
And that's why you can never talk anyone to death when you bring up a guy like Joe Burrow, because you could just go on and on and on and on, and you're just going to be so intrigued. Like, he's just such a fascinating figure from his leadership standpoint, how he balances his confidence with, his humility. I mean, I'll kind of give this away to some of our listeners. I'm working on a little special piece on kind of his leadership effect from a leadership point of view. So stay tuned for that in the coming weeks. But you couldn't have said it better, Marissa. Wish we had more time on this podcast, but always a special time with you. So glad I got to meet you this year, and this is going to be the first of many more conversations to come, especially in the offseason. But once again, that's Marissa Contepelli, Bengals team reporter and senior producer. You can catch her on Twitter. Is it Bengals Marissa? Is that your Twitter handle?
It is.
Bengals Marissa. Catch her on Twitter at Bengals Marissa. Marissa, appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. Love joining you today. And yeah, hopefully we're able to connect a couple more times before the season gets going again.
Likewise. And thanks for staying with us on this off-season edition of the Strictly Stripes podcast. So, Mike, I was just with Marissa Contepelli, the Bengals team reporter, and we talked about the extensions of Joe Burrow, the possible extension of T. Higgins, and there's one name we didn't mention earlier in the show that I don't think we talked a lot about last week, and that's Logan Wilson, who obviously we're talking offense. He's a linebacker. He's also eligible for an extension. He's got the last year of his rookie deal coming up. I think it's an absolute dream to hope that you could extend Logan Wilson and T. Higgins and Joe Burrow with Jamar Chase in mind for 2024. But that's a lot to ask for. Like, it's a lot to ask for Chase, Burrow, and Higgins. I think asking for Wilson is like a miracle. And obviously we've talked about Jermaine Pratt. It seems like the writing's on the wall. He's not going to be returning. It looks like they're going to let him walk if we had to guess, as we've said. But is it just a fairy dream to just hope that you get all those guys in Logan Wilson? Or do you think maybe, there's a possibility where you extend his fifth-year option and then maybe next year you kind of revisit that? Like, where do you think Logan Wilson fits in the grand picture of, this whole offseason of extensions?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know that he's a player that is, what his worth is. He's good, but the linebackers that tend to get paid are ones that, are sort of game wreckers, that can rush the quarterback, have that more of a pass rushing capability. He's more of a guy that's using coverage, that can cover the field, that's, stout against the run. But I don't know what the value is there. Like, what is he going to be looking for, what he's worth? I certainly don't think that he's going to be kind of one of those, top 20 guys at the position. I feel like he'd be outside of that. Obviously he's an important part of the defense. Do you want to start over at linebacker? Within a 2-year stretch, you probably don't. But you also, obviously you mentioned limited funds with some of the other defensive contracts. I think if you can get him, is it $12 million a year? Is that worth it to try to sign him, or can you draft somebody this year as his eventual replacement? I think that's a possibility where, they did that last year with Dax Hill and Cam Taylor-Britt, where they sort of drafted the veterans replacement. Logan's a little younger than the guys that, Eli Apple, but, that could be the path they go down to try to save some money, because, they're going to have to cut costs at some positions, and can you afford that linebacker? I think in Lou Anarumo's defense, the secondary is so important. I think you can kind of get by with trying to train linebackers. A lot of them have similar skill sets, just, in terms of being able to cover the field as Logan Wilson, instead of being those guys that, just wreck defensive fronts like a Khalil Mack or a Joey Bosa type, somebody like that. I don't think he's in the level of a Roquan Smith, but he's certainly a capable and dependable player, but it'll just be, I just don't know what that worth is anymore. At a middle linebacker, it's a position that's obviously changed over the last 10, 15 years.
The Bengals got a steal with Logan Wilson because he's got a pretty cheap rookie contract. It's a 4-year deal that's worth just under $5 million. Last year was the first year he made over $1 million in his base salary, unless you want to include other years where he made less than that, but you added a signing bonus. But yeah, he just made over $1 million in his base salary. The market value, according to Spot Track, his projection market value-wise is $9.4 million annually, which would only make him like the 30th richest linebacker. Because, like you said, I mean, we're not talking about a Joey Bosa or Khalil Mack, or I think a better example, because we're talking inside linebacker, Roquan Smith, who he got a boatload in Baltimore. He's not going anywhere. And I think he's probably, with respect to Wilson, the best linebacker in the AFC North. But I don't know. I think on the one hand, you look at it as like, they're not going to bring back Jesse Bates. That writing's on the wall. We talked about Jermaine Pratt. Are Chase and Higgins willing to take a little bit of a pay cut? And is Burrow, maybe this is a stretch, is he thinking far enough to where he doesn't want to just keep, a Higgins or a Chase? Like, does he realize how much value someone like Logan Wilson brings? I think that might be a stretch because then it's like, well, what about Trey Hendrickson? What about DJ Reader? Like eventually, as much as Joe Burrow is very unselfish, undoubtedly so, and wants to think about keeping everyone, he also knows that he's got to look out for his own, look out for himself. And I know the Bengals would agree with that too. I mean, if you want to even consider an extension or at least a fifth-year option, like we said, he's more of a three-down back than Jermaine Pratt was. They were both good in coverage. I think Pratt was a little better, but where Wilson exploded was he was a versatile tackler. His tackling took off in the second half of the year, even as he battled a shoulder injury before the bye week. But again, though, on the other side of that, like it's wishful thinking to really pay someone like that, anywhere near maybe that 9.4 mil or maybe somewhere in that projection. You have Akeem Davis-Gaither, you have Joe Bocci and Marcus Bailey. Marcus Bailey's been used in sub packages. You can get him more reps. I think Akeem Davis-Gaither is worthy of being a starter, and we could talk more about him next week when we do our positional roundups. And again, the draft is the draft. You can always look for some talent in the draft, and I think there's some pretty good linebackers in the draft, which we can talk about in the future. We talked a little bit about that with the Senior Bowl that just wrapped up. So it's wishful thinking. It's not out of the possibility, but I don't think it's the end of the world if you can't extend him or keep him beyond the fifth-year option. So I think that's just the most sensible solution. And again, he's a great linebacker. For all we know, if he has an outstanding year that's way beyond what he did the last 2 years, that value could go up, and then it's like, it's going to be really tough. Like, he might be in a Jermaine Pratt situation where he's in the contract year and he has a killer year like Pratt had, and then it's like, might have to let him walk. So I think the cards will kind of lay themselves out there. But just to kind of wrap up, we're taping this on a Tuesday night, and so the NFL honors, Hall of Fame announcements are going to be later tonight. Of course, for Bengals fans, they're keeping their eyes on former cornerback Ken Riley and former tackle Willie Anderson, who could be selected for all we know. Anderson's one of the 15 finalists on the ballot. Riley is a senior finalist. He'd be posthumously inducted since he passed away in 2020. But if you kind of had to make your own, I know I'm putting you on the spot here, Mike, but if you had to make your own Hall of Fame ballot, who are you picking? I saw Joe Thomas is on the list. You got Patrick Willis. You got a few other guys in between. You've seen a lot of these guys in their prime. Who would you kind of pick? And do you put Riley or Anderson in that list somewhere along the way?
I'm looking at the list. We talked about this earlier in the year, and I meant, I thought Devin Hester is certainly deserving.
That's a good one.
A specialist who changed the game. I don't know that he'll get enough attention. I think the guy that kind of stands out on the ballot this year is Reggie Wayne. Just what he did with Peyton Manning and the longevity. Played from 2001 to 2014. It's certainly I think he has the numbers, and obviously, it's critical to Peyton Manning's success throughout the years in Indianapolis. Just kind of trying to see. I don't know how many votes that each person gets or whatever, but I guess the next person would, offensive line is Joe Thomas.
I was going to say Joe Thomas.
Had a huge impact. Obviously, the success of that organization wasn't where it was at with some others on this list, but he might be like the next guy that would be on my personal ballot. But those probably are the three that I would say.
Yeah, I think, and nothing against Willie Anderson, but I think what might make it tough for him is, when you got Joe Thomas on the other side of that ballot, it's a little tough. And granted, this is the second time Anderson's been a finalist for the Hall of Fame. It's his 10th year of eligibility because he's been retired since 2008. But, Joe Thomas did a lot with very little, like you said. So did Anderson technically, but Anderson at least made a playoff, and he backed up, 2 Pro Bowl running backs like Corey Dillon and Rudy Johnson. Who did Joe Thomas have with him? Like a million gazillion quarterbacks and running backs. So unless you want to count Peyton Hillis, but even then, that's still a lot for one guy to do on their own. I think Darrelle Revis really sticks out. For me, I grew up when he was kind of in his prime with the Jets, and then, he goes to New England, wins a Super Bowl, kind of wraps up his career with Tampa Bay. I think, if you're talking a defensive back, and again, this is maybe where it might be tough for Ken Riley, but I could see Revis getting that. Riley's in a different situation because he needs 80% of the votes from the finalist committee because he's in kind of a interesting category. But If I had to pick one Bengal, like if I think it's going to be Anderson or Riley, I would say Riley just because, again, I think with Anderson, it's a really deep class that includes Joe Thomas. The thing about Riley that people forget is he is tied for the 5th most interceptions in the league. Do you know who's tied with him, Mike, for the 5th most interceptions in the league? You probably know this name. He's a household name.
I do not.
Just retired recently.
I do not.
It's Charles Woodson. Charles Woodson is tied with him for 65 picks. And Woodson actually is already in the Hall of Fame. He got inducted about 2 years ago. So, I mean, you're up there with a guy like Charles Woodson and the other 4 guys ahead of
recently
Riley.
Retired. Recently is doing a lot of work. He retired in 2016.
It's like, what? Half a decade ago is recent to me.
He retired, within the last couple of years in 2016. No, that's not recently. That's like
recent inductee, because he's only been in for 2 years now.
He retired recently. You didn't say he was a recent inductee. You said he retired recently.
Recently retired within the half decade, 5 years ago, but more recently inducted. There, I clarified it. Maybe my definition of recent is more broad, but to each their own. But yeah, I mean, when you're in company with Charles Woodson and you only have guys like Paul Krause, who's the all-time leader in picks ahead of you, I think you have to look at what he did. I mean, he's a 3-time All-Pro. Again, he never made a Pro Bowl, but he played in the Super Bowl when the Bengals won their first AFC title. He defended some of the best quarterbacks in NFL history in the 70s. I mean, you think about some of the guys on the other side of the ball, like Ken Stabler and Terry Bradshaw, going against guys like that. That's a tall task. So I don't know. That's just me making a case for him. But I do think at some point, Willie Anderson will get in. If it's not this year, he will get his time soon. But we won't know till we find out tonight. So we'll definitely keep our eyes on that. But tomorrow, a.k.a. Friday, Andrew Gillis will join us as we talk about the Super Bowl, the game the Bengals aren't in, but we're going to talk about it anyway, talk more free agency, more offseason as we set the stage for the rest of the month. But once again, for myself and Mike Nislek, I'm Muhammad Ahmad. Have a great rest of